You have spent your entire life believing your family built its fortune alone, Charles Whitmore said, his steady voice carrying across the grand ballroom. But the truth is, we owe this woman a future. Every crystal chandelier seemed to lose its sparkle as silence settled over the Whitmore estate like fresh snow. Hundreds of guests stood frozen beneath towering white columns wrapped in ivy and soft golden lights, their champagne glasses suspended halfway to their lips. Conversations dissolved into whispers before disappearing altogether. At the center of the room, Naomi Brooks stopped walking. The silver serving tray in her hands suddenly felt twice as heavy, though not a single glass rattled. She lowered her eyes, convinced the billionaire couldn't possibly be speaking to her. She had worked enough private events to know how invisible people in black service uniforms were supposed to be. Wealthy families rarely remembered the faces pouring their coffee, collecting their plates, or quietly polishing fingerprints from marble tables after everyone had gone home. Tonight was no different. She had arrived before sunrise, helped prepare the Whitmore family's annual memorial banquet, and planned to disappear before midnight with sore feet and another modest paycheck waiting to cover rent, groceries, and her grandmother's medication. That had been the entire plan. Instead, every eye in the ballroom slowly turned toward her. Naomi resisted the urge to step backward. She could already feel curious stares measuring everything about her. The neatly pressed uniform, the inexpensive black flats, the tiny silver necklace she had worn every day since her mother passed away. She knew those looks. They weren't loud, but they carried questions people rarely asked out loud. Why is she standing there? Did she make a mistake? Did she interrupt something important? Charles Whitmore descended the short staircase from the stage with deliberate steps, his polished shoes echoing across the marble floor. At 58, he carried himself with the calm confidence of a man accustomed to making billion-dollar decisions before breakfast, yet tonight there was something unusually restrained in his expression. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He looked like someone finally arriving at a destination after wandering for years. Naomi lifted her gaze just enough to meet his eyes. She had never spoken to him before. She doubted he even knew her name. The event coordinator certainly hadn't introduced the catering staff to the guests. Yet Charles walked directly toward her, stopping only a few feet away. Behind him, members of the Whitmore family exchanged uneasy glances. A woman in an elegant emerald gown quietly shook her head, as if silently urging him to reconsider whatever he intended to do next. An older attorney standing near the stage tightened his grip on a worn leather folder tucked beneath his arm. Even the longtime house manager, Margaret Doyle, stood perfectly still beside the entrance, watching with an expression that suggested she had waited years for this exact moment. Charles took a slow breath before speaking again. "Naomi Brooks," he said softly enough that the room leaned in to hear every word. "My father asked me to find you. I failed him for far too long. But tonight, before every member of my family, I'm going to keep a promise that should have been honored years ago." Confusion spread through the ballroom faster than any rumor. Naomi's heartbeat echoed inside her chest as countless unanswered questions collided in her mind. She had never met Charles Whitmore's father. She had never received a letter, a phone call, or an invitation from anyone connected to this family. Yet Charles reached inside the inner pocket of his navy suit and carefully removed an aged cream-colored envelope, its edges softened by time, its faded wax seal still remarkably intact. Holding it with both hands as though it were the most valuable possession he owned, he looked directly at Naomi and quietly said, "This letter has been hidden for years, and everything my family believed about our future begins with your mother's name." Naomi could not bring herself to reach for the envelope. Her fingers remained wrapped around the polished silver tray as though letting go of it might somehow erase the only certainty she still had. The ballroom was so quiet that she could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning drifting through the vaulted ceiling and the distant ticking of an antique grandfather clock standing against the far wall. Charles Whitmore waited patiently, making no attempt to force the moment. His eyes carried neither pity nor superiority, only the quiet weight of unfinished responsibility. Around them, members of his family shifted uncomfortably. Some guests exchanged skeptical glances while others whispered behind carefully raised glasses. To them, Naomi was simply another catering employee whose name had somehow wandered into a conversation where it did not belong. They had seen her throughout the afternoon arranging centerpieces, carrying trays, and quietly replacing folded linen napkins without drawing attention to herself. She had smiled politely whenever someone thanked her and accepted complete silence from those who never noticed she was there. It was a life she understood well. Invisible people learned early that disappointment hurt less when expectations stayed small. Naomi had been raised by her mother to believe that dignity never depended on the opinion of strangers. After her mother passed away, those words became the foundation of everything she did. Every morning before sunrise, she prepared breakfast for her grandmother, organized medication into a small plastic container marked with each day of the week, and caught 2 different city buses across town before beginning her first shift. On weekends, she accepted private catering jobs because every extra dollar mattered. Medical appointments, rent, electricity, and groceries left very little room for anything else. College had once been part of her future, but life had quietly rewritten those plans one difficult season at a time. Even so, she never complained. She simply adjusted, believing that kindness was one thing poverty could never take away. Margaret Doyle watched Naomi with gentle eyes from across the ballroom. Unlike most of the guests, Margaret recognized the young woman immediately. She had seen Naomi arrive hours before everyone else, thanking every kitchen worker by name and helping a new employee carry heavy serving equipment without being asked. Small acts like those rarely appeared important to wealthy families. Yet Margaret had spent 40 years inside the Whitmore household, learning that character revealed itself most clearly when no one important was watching. Charles slowly lowered the envelope instead of handing it to Naomi. His voice remained calm as he addressed the room instead of the woman standing before him. "Many of you believe success begins with wealth," he said quietly. "My father believed it begins with gratitude. Somewhere along the way, this family remembered one and forgot the other." An uneasy silence answered him. No one challenged his words, but neither did anyone volunteer agreement. Near the front row, his cousin Victoria Whitmore folded her arms tightly across her designer jacket. Her expression hardened as she glanced toward Naomi with open disbelief. In her mind, family legacies belonged to boardrooms, investment portfolios, and carefully written wills, not to a woman wearing a catering uniform. Naomi noticed the look but refused to meet it. She had spent too many years allowing silent judgments to pass over her like rain against a window. They no longer defined who she was. Charles looked back toward the envelope resting in his hands before lifting his eyes to Naomi once more. "Before anyone decides what this letter means," he said softly, "you deserve to know why my father spent the last years of his life searching for someone he never stopped calling the bravest woman he had ever met. That story did not begin with me. It began 30 years ago, with your mother." Charles held the unopened envelope against his chest for a long moment before looking toward the portraits that lined the ballroom walls. The largest painting belonged to his late father, William Whitmore, whose calm expression overlooked generations of family celebrations, business victories, and charitable galas. Tonight, however, the portrait seemed to watch over something far more personal. Charles drew a slow breath. "30 years ago," he began, "my father was not the man everyone remembers. He was ambitious, impatient, and convinced that hard work alone explained every success he enjoyed." No one interrupted him. Even the musicians standing near the stage quietly lowered their instruments. Charles continued, his voice steady. "One rainy October evening, while driving through the eastern side of the city after visiting a construction site, his car lost control near a flooded intersection. The vehicle became trapped, and before emergency crews could arrive, someone reached him first." Naomi felt an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. She had never heard this story before. Charles looked directly at her. "That person was your mother, Angela Brooks." The name settled over the room with unexpected weight. Naomi lowered her eyes as memories surfaced without warning. She remembered her mother coming home exhausted after double shifts at the community clinic. She remembered the faded blue jacket that still smelled faintly of antiseptic, the packed lunches wrapped in wax paper, and the quiet smile that somehow survived every difficult season. Angela Brooks had never spoken much about herself. Whenever Naomi asked why they never seemed to have enough money, her mother would simply answer, "Richness is measured by what you give away after you have almost nothing left." Charles continued, "My father told me that she never asked who he was. She did not recognize his name, his company, or the expensive watch on his wrist. She only saw another human being who needed help. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. Charles slowly turned toward the attorney, Edward Collins, who nodded almost imperceptibly. When everything was finally under control, my father offered to write her a check. He insisted on paying for her kindness. Angela refused every offer. She smiled and told him that gratitude could not be purchased. Naomi felt her grandmother's familiar words echo inside her memory. They were almost identical. Charles swallowed carefully before continuing. Eventually, my father asked if there was anything he could ever do in return. She thought for a long time before answering. Then she said something he repeated to me until the day he died. Charles paused, allowing the silence to settle over every corner of the ballroom. She said, "If my daughter ever stands where opportunity refuses to see her, promise me you will open the door instead of handing her money. She deserves a chance, not charity." Naomi's breath caught. She had never heard those words before, yet they sounded exactly like the woman who had raised her. Angela Brooks had always believed that dignity grew from opportunity rather than sympathy. Charles looked down at the aged envelope resting in his hands. My father carried those words with him for decades. He searched for Angela many times, but by the time he finally found an address, she had already passed away. He blamed himself for waiting too long. Before his own health began to fail, he wrote everything into this letter and made me swear that I would find Naomi Brooks, no matter how many years it took. Charles gently traced the faded wax seal with his thumb before raising his eyes once more. What I did not know until this week was that the woman we had been searching for had already walked through the front doors of this house many times. And every single time, we thanked her for serving dinner without ever asking her name. The silence that followed felt heavier than any speech that had filled the Whitmore estate in decades. Naomi stood motionless, her thoughts drifting between memories of her mother and the impossible truth unfolding before her. She searched her mind for any story that might explain why Angela Brooks had never mentioned William Whitmore, yet every childhood memory remained the same. Her mother had never spoken about saving a wealthy businessman. She had never hinted that a promise had been made. She had simply lived each day with quiet generosity, never expecting recognition. Across the ballroom, however, not everyone accepted Charles's words with the same quiet reflection. Victoria Whitmore stepped forward, the sharp click of her heels breaking the stillness. She folded her arms and looked directly at Charles before briefly glancing toward Naomi. "This is an emotional story," she said carefully, "but emotions do not determine the future of this family." Several relatives nodded almost immediately. One uncle adjusted his cuff links and cleared his throat. Another quietly whispered that memories could become unreliable after 30 years. Their polished smiles returned, but they no longer carried warmth. Instead, they revealed the familiar confidence of people accustomed to protecting privilege before asking questions. Naomi lowered her eyes again. She had no desire to stand at the center of an argument she had never started. "Sir," she said softly to Charles, "I did not come here expecting anything. I am grateful to hear what you shared about my mother. That is already more than I ever imagined." She gently placed the serving tray onto a nearby table. "If this letter creates problems for your family, perhaps it is better if I leave." She turned slightly, intending to disappear the same quiet way she had entered the ballroom only hours earlier. Before she could take a second step, Charles spoke with unexpected firmness. "No." His voice was calm, but it carried enough conviction that every whisper immediately stopped. "You have spent your entire life walking away from rooms where people decided your value before learning your name. Tonight, no one leaves until my father's final words are heard." Edward Collins slowly approached, still carrying the old leather folder beneath one arm. His silver hair reflected the warm chandelier light as he stopped beside Charles. "The envelope has remained sealed exactly as Mr. William Whitmore instructed," he said. "I have safeguarded it for 12 years. No member of this family has ever read its contents." A ripple of surprise spread across the room. Victoria frowned. Surely father would have discussed something this important with the family board. Edward calmly shook his head. He specifically instructed that no one open the letter until Charles located Naomi Brooks. Charles nodded once before carefully placing the aged envelope upon a polished walnut table positioned beneath his father's portrait. The faded wax seal remained perfectly intact despite the passing years. Every eye in the ballroom settled upon it. It looked ordinary, almost fragile, yet somehow more valuable than every painting, crystal chandelier, and antique sculpture surrounding it. Margaret Doyle quietly stepped closer, her hands folded neatly before her. She looked toward Naomi with gentle encouragement before speaking for the first time that evening. "Your mother once believed that the right opportunity could change generations," she said softly. "Perhaps tonight is not about what this family might lose. Perhaps it is about finally becoming the family William Whitmore hoped we would be." Charles rested one hand beside the unopened letter and looked around the silent ballroom. "For years," he said quietly, "everyone assumed this envelope contained instructions about money or inheritance. My father smiled every time someone guessed. He told me the truth inside would be far more difficult than writing another check." Charles reached toward the faded wax seal with steady fingers. The room collectively held its breath, knowing that once the letter was opened, nothing about the Whitmore family's understanding of their past would ever be the same. Charles broke the faded wax seal with extraordinary care, as though even the smallest tear might disturb the memory his father had protected for so many years. The old paper unfolded with a soft crackle that echoed through the silent ballroom. Time had turned the pages a gentle shade of ivory, but William Whitmore's handwriting remained remarkably clear, each line steady and deliberate. Charles looked down for a long moment before beginning to read aloud. "If this letter has finally reached Naomi Brooks, then I have already left this world knowing I waited far too long to keep a promise made by a remarkable woman." The room remained perfectly still. Even those who had doubted the story now listened without interruption. Charles continued, his voice growing quieter with every sentence. "Angela Brooks never asked me for money. She never asked for influence, employment, or recognition. She asked me for something much more difficult. She asked me to remember that opportunity changes lives more deeply than charity ever can." Naomi closed her eyes for only a second. The words sounded exactly like her mother's quiet philosophy. William's letter continued, "If you are reading this, Charles, then I trust you have found Angela's daughter. Before you do anything else, understand this. She owes our family nothing. We are the ones who carry the debt." A few members of the Whitmore family exchanged uneasy glances. Victoria slowly lowered her arms, though skepticism still lingered across her face. Charles turned the page. "Do not insult Naomi Brooks by offering her money as payment for an act of kindness performed decades ago. A check can settle an account. Gratitude cannot. If you simply hand her wealth, you will fail to understand everything Angela tried to teach me." Edward Collins quietly removed his glasses and held them in one hand, staring toward the floor as Charles continued reading. "Instead, ask yourself a harder question. What future would have been possible if Angela's daughter had received every opportunity she earned but never found? Help build that future. Do not buy her silence with generosity. Stand beside her until she no longer needs anyone to open a door that should never have been closed." Naomi felt tears gathering in her eyes, but she blinked them away before they could fall. She was not crying because of money. In fact, William had mentioned none. She was overwhelmed because someone had understood her mother so completely. Charles reached the final page. His voice became almost a whisper. "To every member of my family who may one day hear these words, remember this. Our greatest inheritance has never been our company, our homes, or our investments. Those things can be created again. Character cannot. If Naomi Brooks chooses to walk away after reading this letter, let her leave with her dignity untouched. If she chooses to stay, then earn the privilege of helping her build the future her mother dreamed of. That future is not a gift. It is a promise we failed to keep." Charles lowered the letter slowly. No one spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. The expensive ballroom, filled with priceless artwork and generations of wealth, suddenly seemed insignificant beside 3 handwritten pages from a man who had spent his final years regretting a promise delayed. Naomi looked toward Charles, her voice barely above a breath. "My mother never told me any of this." Charles met her eyes with quiet humility. "I do not believe she wanted you to grow up expecting anything from us." He folded the letter carefully before adding, "Which is exactly why my father believed your future had to be earned through our actions, not purchased with our fortune." No one moved. The applause that usually followed every Whitmore speech never came. Instead, the ballroom settled into a silence so complete that the faint crackling of the fireplace could be heard beneath the distant hum of the ventilation system. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the evening sky had deepened into soft shades of blue and silver, and a light breeze stirred the branches of the old oak trees lining the estate. Their shadows drifted slowly across the marble floor, reminding Naomi of evenings spent sitting on the small porch with her mother years ago. Angela Brooks had always loved quiet. She believed silence gave truth enough room to breathe. Naomi slowly reached up and touched the tiny silver necklace resting against her collarbone. It had belonged to her mother, and for years it had been the only thing she owned that felt truly priceless. She had worn it through every interview that ended with polite rejection, every overnight shift, every long bus ride across the city, and every difficult conversation with doctors caring for her grandmother. She had never imagined that one ordinary piece of jewelry would suddenly feel connected to a promise made before she was old enough to remember. Charles remained standing beside the walnut table, but the confidence that usually defined him had quietly disappeared. He no longer looked like one of the most respected business leaders in America. He looked like a son trying to understand the measure of his father's regret. His eyes rested on the letter for several long seconds before he folded it carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. He did not hide it again. Instead, he left it where everyone could see it. Margaret Doyle watched the gesture with gentle approval. She understood what Charles had done. The letter was no longer a family secret. It had become a family mirror. Around the ballroom, conversations never resumed. Several guests lowered their eyes, reflecting on the uncomfortable possibility that they had walked past Naomi more than once without seeing the person behind the uniform. One elderly couple quietly thanked a catering employee as she refilled their water glasses, something they had forgotten to do all evening. It was a small moment, almost invisible, yet Margaret noticed it immediately. Sometimes change did not begin with grand speeches. Sometimes it began with the simple decision to truly see another human being. Naomi finally stepped toward Charles. Her footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor before she stopped a respectful distance away. She smiled, not with excitement, but with quiet gratitude. "Your father honored my mother more tonight than she ever would have expected," she said gently. "That is already enough for me." Charles looked at her with sincere respect. "Do you truly believe that?" Naomi nodded. "My mother never measured life by what people gave her. She measured it by the opportunities she created for someone else." She glanced toward the envelope before continuing. "If she were standing here, she would probably tell both of us to stop talking about the past and start helping someone who needs tomorrow." Those words lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. Charles felt something shift inside him. For years he had believed he was preparing to repay an old debt. Standing before Naomi, he realized repayment had never been possible. Gratitude was not a transaction. It was a responsibility carried forward through actions. As the last light of evening slipped through the tall windows and settled across William Whitmore's portrait, Charles quietly understood that opening the letter had not fulfilled his father's promise. It had only revealed where the promise truly began. The guests slowly began leaving the ballroom, but the conversation that had filled the estate only hours earlier never returned. Instead, people walked through the marble corridors with thoughtful expressions, speaking in quieter voices than before. Some paused beneath William Whitmore's portrait one last time before stepping into the cool evening air, as though they had discovered something far more valuable than the elegant banquet they had come to attend. Naomi remained near the tall windows, watching the lights from the city shimmer in the distance. She expected someone to hand her another serving assignment or politely remind her that the event had ended. Instead, she found herself alone with Charles, Margaret, and Edward Collins. The enormous room suddenly felt less like a mansion and more like an ordinary place where difficult truths had finally found their way home. Charles walked toward Edward. "I need every record my father left behind," he said quietly. "Everything. His journals, appointments, letters, foundation files, scholarship notes. If he spent years searching for Naomi's family, I want to understand why." Edward nodded. "I anticipated you might ask." He reached into the leather folder and removed several neatly organized documents. These were never part of the estate records. Your father kept them separate because he said they were reminders, not assets. Charles accepted the papers and immediately noticed photographs clipped to handwritten notes. There was an old newspaper article about a neighborhood literacy program. Another showed volunteers serving meals at a community center. In nearly every photograph, somewhere in the background, stood Angela Brooks, smiling quietly without ever looking toward the camera. Beneath one picture, William had written a single sentence in blue ink. "She changes lives without waiting for permission." Charles continued reading. His father's notes stretched across years. Every few months, there was another attempt to locate Angela, another conversation with community leaders, another reminder that he had waited too long. Then the entries changed. Angela had passed away. William's handwriting became heavier, slower. One note stopped Charles completely. Her daughter enrolled in college, but withdrew after one semester to care for family. Opportunity delayed is still opportunity denied. Charles looked up. "Naomi, did you leave school because of your grandmother?" Naomi smiled gently. "My mother became sick first. After she passed away, my grandmother needed someone. There was never really a decision to make." She said it so simply that the sacrifice almost disappeared inside the sentence. Charles lowered the papers. "Did you ever plan to go back?" Naomi hesitated before answering. "Every January I promised myself I would. Every September another bill arrived first." Margaret quietly looked away, giving Naomi the dignity of not being watched during such an honest moment. Charles suddenly understood what his father had tried to explain all those years ago. The future William wanted to protect had never been hidden inside a bank account. It had been interrupted one ordinary hardship at a time until a gifted young woman quietly accepted that other people's needs would always come before her own dreams. He looked again at the letter resting on the walnut table. His father's words echoed with unmistakable clarity. "Do not give her money. Give her the future she deserves." For the first time, Charles understood that his father had never asked him to repay a debt. He had challenged him to remove every unnecessary barrier standing between Naomi Brooks and the life she had earned long before anyone in the Whitmore family ever learned her name. As that realization settled over him, Charles folded the documents carefully, met Naomi's calm eyes, and knew exactly what the next morning needed to become. The next morning arrived with clear skies and cool autumn air washing over the city. Sunlight poured through the glass walls of Whitmore Global Headquarters, casting long reflections across polished stone floors where executives hurried toward conference rooms carrying laptops and steaming cups of coffee. At exactly 9 o'clock, the members of the Whitmore Foundation Board gathered around the largest table in the building, expecting another routine quarterly meeting. Instead, they found Charles Whitmore standing alone beside the windows, William's letter resting quietly on the table before him. There were no financial reports projected onto the screen and no charts waiting to be discussed. Charles looked around the room before speaking. "Today we are not approving another donation," he said calmly. "We are correcting a failure that has lasted for 3 decades." Confused expressions filled the room. Victoria Whitmore glanced at the meeting agenda and found only one item listed in bold letters: the Brooks Opportunity Initiative. Charles explained every detail without rushing. The foundation would establish a permanent scholarship honoring Angela Brooks for students whose education had been interrupted while caring for family members. Tuition, books, housing assistance, transportation, and professional mentoring would all be included because opportunity required more than acceptance letters. The board listened in complete silence. Then Charles added something no one expected. "The program will not be managed by consultants who study hardship from conference rooms. It will be led by someone who has actually lived it." At that moment, the conference room doors opened quietly. Naomi Brooks stepped inside, wearing a simple navy suit borrowed from a neighborhood friend who believed first impressions still mattered. She carried herself with the same quiet confidence she had shown while serving dinner the night before, but today there was no silver tray in her hands. Only a notebook and a pen. Several board members immediately stood, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect had replaced assumption. Charles smiled warmly. "Miss Brooks has accepted my invitation to help design every part of this initiative. No one understands the barriers facing hardworking families better than someone who has walked through them herself." Naomi took a slow breath before speaking. "I appreciate your confidence," she said gently. "But if I agree to do this, I want the program to reach people who have already started believing their dreams are too expensive." Charles nodded without hesitation. That is exactly why you belong here. The board unanimously approved the proposal before the meeting ended. News spread quickly through the company. Employees who had passed Naomi in hallways during past catering events now greeted her by name. Margaret Doyle visited Naomi later that afternoon carrying a small wooden box that had once belonged to William Whitmore. Inside rested the fountain pen he had used to write the letter years before. Margaret smiled softly as she handed it over. "He always believed promises should build something after they are spoken," she said. Naomi carefully held the pen between her hands, feeling the weight of history without feeling trapped by it. She looked through the office windows toward the city stretching beyond the skyline and realized that her mother's greatest lesson had quietly come full circle. Kindness had never been about waiting for gratitude. It had always been about creating another beginning for someone else. Charles watched her from across the room and understood that his father's promise was no longer written only on aging paper. From this day forward, it would be written into classrooms, careers, and futures that would exist because one remarkable woman chose compassion over recognition many years before anyone imagined the lives she would eventually change. 1 year later, the auditorium at Whitmore Community College filled long before the ceremony began. Families found their seats, proud parents adjusted graduation caps, and students laughed nervously as they waited for their names to be called. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting warm patterns across the wooden stage where a simple podium stood beside a banner that read, "The Angela Brooks Opportunity Initiative." Naomi Brooks waited quietly behind the curtain, holding the same fountain pen Margaret Doyle had entrusted to her months before. She carried it to every scholarship interview, every planning meeting, and every student orientation as a silent reminder that one promise, faithfully kept, could outlive generations. When her name was announced, the audience rose in applause that felt genuine rather than ceremonial. Naomi walked to the podium with calm, measured steps. She looked across the room and saw faces filled with hope instead of uncertainty. Many of the scholarship recipients had stories that reminded her of her own. Some had paused their education to care for aging parents. Others had worked 2 jobs to support younger siblings. A few had almost abandoned college altogether because opportunity had seemed just beyond reach. Naomi smiled warmly before speaking. "People often ask me what changed my life," she said. "The answer is not money. It was being seen. Someone finally looked beyond my circumstances and believed my future was still worth investing in. I hope every person sitting here today remembers that your story is never finished simply because life asks you to take the longer road." Her words settled gently over the audience. There were no dramatic gestures, no grand declarations, only quiet truth spoken with the confidence of someone who had lived every sentence. In the back row, Charles Whitmore remained standing near the entrance, refusing the reserved seat prepared for him in the front. He watched the students applaud Naomi with a quiet smile that carried neither pride nor ownership. This day did not belong to him. It belonged to every future that had finally been given room to grow. Beside him, Margaret Doyle folded her hands together and glanced toward William Whitmore's framed photograph displayed near the stage entrance. Fresh white flowers rested beneath it, and the old letter, now preserved behind protective glass, stood beside the photograph where every student could read its final lines before entering the auditorium. Throughout the year, hundreds of visitors had paused there, discovering that true wealth was measured not by what people accumulated, but by the opportunities they created for others. As the ceremony came to an end, graduates gathered outside beneath bright blue skies, laughing together while families embraced and cameras captured new beginnings. Naomi stepped onto the front lawn and looked across the campus where students hurried between brick buildings carrying backpacks filled with possibilities rather than burdens. Charles quietly approached and stopped beside her. Neither of them spoke for several moments. There was nothing left that required explanation. The breeze carried the soft rustling of oak leaves overhead, almost like pages turning in an old book whose final chapter had been written exactly as it was meant to be. Charles looked toward the students before speaking just 4 simple words. "My father was right." Naomi smiled gently, her eyes following a group of scholarship recipients walking confidently toward the future they had earned. She lightly touched the silver necklace resting over her heart, then looked toward the sunlight stretching across the campus. The promise that had begun with one act of kindness decades earlier no longer belonged to a single family. It now lived inside every door that would open for someone who only needed the chance to walk through it.